illusion of benevolence. You may already know someone like this. Perhaps they sit at your dinner table, occupy the office next to yours, or worse, have become the voice you've learned to trust above your own. This person appears normal, even admirable. They listen attentively, offer guidance with unwavering confidence, and make you feel special, chosen even. But beneath this facade lies what Jung identified as a pathological inflation of the ego, a psychological condition that doesn't just destroy the person who embodies it, but systematically contaminates everyone within their sphere of influence. Jung's concept of ego inflation describes a state where an individual's sense of self becomes so enlarged and rigid that they lose all capacity for self-reflection. Unlike simple arrogance, which often masks insecurity, ego inflation represents a complete psychological takeover. The inflated person genuinely believes they have transcended ordinary human limitations. They don't merely think they're right. They experience their perspective as the only valid interpretation of reality. This creates what Jung called a corruption of consciousness. The inflated individual operates from a position of absolute certainty, viewing any disagreement not as a difference of opinion, but as evidence of the other person's fundamental inadequacy. They have become, in essence, psychologically possessed by their own sense of superiority. What makes this personality type so dangerous is precisely what makes them so difficult to identify. They rarely resort to overt aggression or obvious manipulation. Instead, they employ what we might call therapeutic tyranny, a form of control that disguises itself as care, guidance, or even love. Consider how this manifests in daily interaction. When you express doubt about their judgment, they respond with patient concern for your inability to see clearly. When you assert your own perspective, they frame your independence as ingratitude or emotional immaturity. They don't attack your ideas directly. Instead, they systematically undermine your confidence in your ability to think for yourself. This process is so gradual and seemingly benevolent that victims often don't recognize what's happening until their psychological autonomy has been severely compromised. You begin to second-guess memories, doubt your emotional responses, and defer to their superior understanding of situations you once navigated confidently on your own. The inflated ego possesses an almost supernatural ability to identify and exploit psychological vulnerabilities. Jung understood that we all carry what he termed the shadow, the collection of our rejected, feared, or underdeveloped aspects of self. This shadow creates natural points of insecurity that the inflated person can detect and manipulate with surgical precision. They don't target your obvious strengths, they target your secret fears, your fear of being ordinary, your anxiety about making mistakes, your deep need for meaning and belonging. They study these vulnerabilities not with conscious malice, but with the instinctive cunning of a psychological predator who has learned to identify weakness as automatically as a hunter tracks prey. In our modern world of infinite complexity and constant uncertainty, the inflated ego offers something irresistibly appealing: absolute answers. They don't present themselves as fellow travelers on the uncertain journey of human existence. Instead, they position themselves as guides who have already arrived at the destination, offering to lead you to the same enlightened state, provided you surrender your stubborn attachment to independent thought. This seduction is particularly powerful because it addresses a fundamental human anxiety. We are all, at some level, terrified of being wrong, of being insignificant, of navigating life without clear direction. The inflated person offers to relieve you of these burdens, but the price is your psychological autonomy. Jung recognized that ego inflation rarely remains contained within a single individual. Like a psychological virus, it spreads through communities, families, and organizations through what he called psychic contagion. This process doesn't require conscious conspiracy or deliberate manipulation. It happens naturally when people, seeking relief from uncertainty, gradually surrender their critical thinking to someone who radiates absolute confidence. The contagion begins innocuously. A strong personality emerges within a group, offering clear answers and decisive leadership. Initially, this feels helpful, even necessary, but over time, the dynamic shifts. What began as voluntary consultation becomes mandatory deference. Alternative viewpoints are no longer welcomed as contributions to discussion. They're treated as threats to group harmony. As the contagion spreads, something remarkable and disturbing occurs. Individual consciousness begins to merge into a collective entity that thinks, feels, and reacts as one. Members of the group no longer ask whether something is true or right. They ask whether it aligns with the leader's vision. They don't evaluate ideas based on merit. They evaluate them based on their source. Jung observed that these psychological colonies could form anywhere: families, businesses, religious communities, even nations. The common thread is always the presence of an inflated ego at the center, surrounded by individuals who have traded their mental independence for the security of belonging to something that feels larger than themselves. Perhaps the most tragic aspect of prolonged exposure to ego inflation is what happens to the victim's relationship with their own inner voice. Jung believed that each person possesses an innate wisdom, a capacity for authentic self-knowledge that develops through honest self-reflection and engagement with uncertainty. When you consistently defer to an external authority who claims superior insight into your own experience, this inner compass begins to atrophy. You stop trusting your intuition, dismissing it as confusion that will be cleared up once you achieve the same level of understanding as your guide. You begin to experience your own thoughts and feelings as obstacles to overcome, rather than information to consider. Living under the influence of an inflated ego eventually requires what amounts to psychological amputation. Aspects of your personality that don't align with their vision of who you should be must be cut away. Your capacity for doubt, your tolerance for ambiguity, your instinct to question authority, all of these become symptoms of your spiritual or emotional immaturity. The most insidious part of this process is how it's framed as growth. You're not losing essential parts of yourself. You're being liberated from the limitations that have held you back. You're not surrendering your autonomy. You're learning to align with higher wisdom. The amputation is performed with anesthesia made of noble-sounding justifications. Jung identified several unmistakable characteristics that mark the presence of dangerous ego inflation. The inflated person never admits uncertainty about significant matters. They may acknowledge minor errors or oversights, but their core beliefs and judgments remain unexamined and unshakable. Any challenge to their perspective is met not with curiosity or engagement, but with a particular kind of dismissal that combines pity with superiority. They don't argue with your ideas. They diagnose your inability to understand. They remain eerily calm during conflicts, not because they've achieved genuine equanimity, but because they experience your distress as confirmation of their superiority, rather than information worth considering. They consistently position themselves as the solution to other people's problems, the voice of reason in chaos, the steady hand in uncertainty. They don't collaborate, they rescue. Recovery from psychological colonization requires what Jung called a return to the self, a painstaking process of reconnecting with your own authentic voice and learning to trust it again. This isn't simply a matter of asserting independence. It's about rebuilding your capacity for genuine self-reflection and honest uncertainty. The first step is often the most difficult, acknowledging that you have, in fact, surrendered significant aspects of your mental autonomy. This recognition typically comes with a wave of shame and self-recrimination. How could you have been so naive? How could you have given away something so precious? But Jung understood that this susceptibility isn't a personal failing. It's a universal human vulnerability. We are all social creatures who need connection and meaning. The inflated ego exploits these legitimate needs, offering counterfeit versions that satisfy temporarily while slowly poisoning the capacity for authentic relationship. True recovery involves more than simply distancing yourself from inflated personalities. It requires developing what Jung called conscious suffering, the willingness to live with uncertainty, to sit with difficult emotions, and to face the reality of your own limitations without seeking rescue from an external authority. This means learning to tolerate the anxiety that comes with not knowing, the discomfort of making mistakes, and the loneliness that sometimes accompanies independent thought. It means developing genuine humility, not the performative self-deprecation that inflated egos often demand from their followers, but the authentic recognition that you are a fallible human being doing your best to navigate a complex world. Once you understand how ego inflation operates, you can develop immunity to its effects. This doesn't mean becoming cynical or refusing all guidance from others. Instead, it means maintaining what Jung called the observing ego, a part of yourself that remains alert to attempts to bypass your critical thinking, no matter how well-intentioned they may appear. You learn to notice when someone consistently positions themselves as having transcended normal human limitations. You become sensitive to the subtle ways people attempt to make you doubt your own perceptions. You recognize the difference between genuine wisdom, which acknowledges its own limitations, and inflated certainty, which claims to have none. Jung's exploration of ego inflation ultimately points to a profound truth about human consciousness. Our greatest strength and our greatest vulnerability both lie in our capacity for self-doubt, the ability to question our own assumptions, to remain open to correction, to acknowledge the limits of our understanding. These aren't signs of weakness. They're the foundations of psychological health and authentic relationship. The inflated ego represents the corruption of this capacity, the transformation of healthy self-reflection into rigid certainty, of genuine confidence into defensive superiority, of authentic leadership into psychological domination. Your defense against this corruption isn't more certainty or stronger opinions. It's the cultivation of what we might call conscious uncertainty, the ability to hold your convictions lightly, to remain curious about alternative perspectives, and to trust your capacity to navigate complexity without needing someone else to provide all the answers. This is perhaps the most radical act of psychological resistance available to us, the refusal to surrender our uncertainty to anyone who claims to have eliminated theirs. In a world increasingly divided between competing certainties, the willingness to say, "I don't know, but I'm thinking about it," becomes a profound act of courage. Jung understood that consciousness itself depends on maintaining this tension between knowing and not knowing, between confidence and doubt, between individual autonomy and genuine connection with others. When we surrender this tension to an inflated ego, whether our own or someone else's, we don't achieve enlightenment or peace. We achieve a kind of psychological death that masquerades as transcendence. The most dangerous person you will ever meet is not the one who threatens you with external force, but the one who offers to relieve you of the burden of thinking for yourself. And the most courageous thing you can do in response is to politely decline their offer and walk away, maintaining your right to remain beautifully, uncertainly, authentically human.